Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video I will be talking about Rebecca by Daphne Du Maurier. So we're well into October now, and this time of year I like to read more suspenseful and or spooky books. And I had never read Rebecca before and it seemed like a good fit. So Rebecca is about a young woman who meets a mysterious, older, rich widower. So they meet in France, and he decides he wants to marry her very quickly, suspiciously quickly. And she's like half his age, but she accepts the proposal. She's completely in love with him, and she goes back with him to his home, his estate in England, Manderley. And there she finds that the memory of his dead wife, Rebecca, is very much alive. So like right out of the gate, our narrator, she is unnamed, by the way, and Maxim are already having issues, and it all kind of boils down to Rebecca. And we also find that the maintenance of Rebecca's memory and a lot of the conflict in this book comes from the housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, who was very attached to Rebecca to a worshipful degree. So I do want to say, well, this is certainly a suspenseful book, and there's like murder and things like that happening. For some reason, I had the misconception that it was like a literal ghost story, that I would see a ghost at some point. But really, it's more of a metaphorical ghost in that Rebecca is always sort of reinserting herself beyond the grave because her mark is all over Manderley. And then at a certain point in the book, the ghost thing gets kind of turned around on the narrator when Mrs. Danvers says, "You're the one who's actually the ghost. You're the one who's forgotten. You're the one who it doesn't even really look like you live here." Like in a way, Rebecca is more alive than the narrator. And even the book itself is like kind of completely overtaken by Rebecca. You know, her name is the title of the book, and our narrator never gets a name. So while there is not like a literal apparition appearing in this book, it's pretty effectively spooky, and I think because I was waiting for a ghost to arrive the whole time, there were a few scenes that were like extra suspenseful. So that kind of gets me into what I think is Daphne Du Maurier's greatest strength as a writer in this, is that her description and her ability to establish tone is really impressive. So she does a lot of scene building work, and we get to really visualize Manderley and the grounds around it, and the weather and the nature and the flowers that are in or out of bloom is all connecting to the emotional resonance of that moment in the story. So it all feels very intentional, and these sort of simple descriptions can carry a lot more meaning in this writer's hands. And the language is really beautiful, which I appreciate. It's certainly description that serves a purpose. And it's also really great with our narrator. She's very much an overthinker, an observer, and we really see that in these sort of long-winded descriptions of everything and these like fantasies and alternate realities that she's envisioning all the time. It's very internal in her head. And the story itself I find really patient. It takes its time to unravel everything. You know, we spend a long time in France before we even see Manderley. We see their lives there, and we get little hints that there's something else going on. There's something else to the story of Rebecca's death. But the pacing is really impressive. It really lays the crumb trail for you and keeps you wanting more. And that pacing really made it like a page turner for me. Like there were times where I should have been going to bed and I wanted to keep reading more because I just needed to know what was going to happen next. So our narrator is often very frustrating. She is young and shy, which accounts for a lot of it, But like if she had taken some more agency earlier on, I think a lot of her problems could have been avoided. And I think that really comes down to like the nature of cringe. Like in like that ContraPoints video, she said that what makes you cringe is like what you hate in yourself when you see it in other people. And something about this narrator kind of reminds me of myself in my teenage years, like this complete avoidance of conflict and this person who never speaks up and is really terrified of criticism, and the kind of like dreamy in her headness and her never really doing anything to make those things come out of her head. And she lives so internally that her vision of everything going on around her is obscured. She sees it through this lens of the story she's telling herself. And then, like, you know, she's such a little mouse the whole time. Like, Mrs. Danvers is openly hostile towards her, like, from the beginning. And it's super obvious that if she would just tell Maxim that, then he would just fire Mrs. Danvers and that would be the end of it. But she never tells him anything. She never shares with him any of the problems that she's having. Of course, communication is not the only problem for this couple, but it's a pretty big one. A quick note on Mrs. Danvers. She is so effectively terrifying. She is so scary. The narrator is so scared of her. And it is like, this was one of those scenes where I could not put the book down, where the narrator first sees Rebecca's old bedroom and how Mrs. Danvers has like completely maintained it as if Rebecca just walked out of the room. Like, it's so creepy, her complete obsession with this dead person and her trying to like keep the ghost alive. And then there's that whole scene where she's like literally trying to kill the narrator by like trying to goad her into jumping out this window. Yeah, so Mrs. Danvers, she serves her purpose in this book. She is very scary. So then Rebecca herself is a very fascinating figure that we get to know more and more over the course of this book. I think we realize long before the narrator does that there is something unsettling about Rebecca, that maybe she was not the best person. But at first, the memory of Rebecca is that she was the perfect lady of Manderley. She had excellent taste. She threw all of these beautiful parties. She was charming, and everyone loved her and found her just like enrapturing. So we see the narrator comparing herself to Rebecca all the time and seeing all of her shortcomings in the praises that people have for Rebecca. And she also kind of like builds up this whole imaginary Rebecca in her head that isn't really based on any fact. It's just sort of how she's envisioning it. And then we sort of very slowly come to learn that Rebecca was kind of cruel. She was unfeeling, not really capable of loving anyone, even though many people loved her. She was having like countless affairs within her marriage with Maxim, like an unending rotating door of men. One of those people she was having an affair with was her cousin, which is obviously very scandalous. It is kind of hard for me to tell, I guess I should have looked into this more, how scandalous that was when the book came out versus now, but it is framed as pretty scandalous. And she seems kind of like sociopathic in that she knows what people want her to be, and she can like play this whole role of the Lady of Manderley, but it's all a facade to get people to do what she wants. And so then her being over everything and still like haunting Manderley is kind of like her last cruel act, her last revenge to try to keep Maxim from being happy. I mean, again, Rebecca titles the book. She is from beyond the grade insisting on making this her story. So then, towards the end of the book, I guess this is where the spoilers come in. This is an old book, so whatever. But we finally find out from Maxim the truth, which, you know, again, if he had been more forthright with his new bride about certain details from the beginning, they could have avoided a lot of things. But basically, you know, Manderley is on the sea, a ship of some kind in like a fog storm thing, makes a mistake and gets stuck. And so there are divers going into the water to try to figure out if they're going to have to take the ship apart or whatever. And they find Rebecca's sailing boat sunken in the water. So Rebecca was assumed to have drowned after a sailing accident. There was a body kind of downriver that was ID'd as Rebecca. But then when they see this boat, there is a body inside, which opens up a lot of questions. So now that he has no choice, Maxim finally comes clean to the narrator. He murdered her. So yes, Rebecca was evil, right? But what pushed Maxim over the edge into like actually shooting her was that she claimed that she was pregnant with one of the guys that she'd had an affair with, presumably the cousin, and that Maxim was going to have to raise the child as his own. Like, that's why he snapped and killed her. So, like, sure, the marriage wasn't good. Rebecca was not a nice person. But I think our narrator takes her husband as a murderer a little too in stride. Like, she's not even remotely concerned about that fact. She's just like excited that he didn't like Rebecca. Like, she just like repeats over and over again, oh, he didn't love her, he didn't love her, he loves me. And it's like, okay, but he's a murderer. So then once we find out that information, sort of the last section of the book is them trying to not be found out so that Maxim doesn't go to trial and is put to death for murdering his beloved wife. So it is really suspenseful, and like the whole last section of the book, it was like you wanted to just keep going and going and going because he was always like right on the verge of getting caught by someone. And Rebecca's cousin gets involved in trying to prove that Maxim did this. There's all these hearings and things, and it's just all very suspenseful. And so then all these other characters who have existed throughout the book, we're looking at in the context of, like, what do they know about Rebecca and Maxim's marriage? And Mrs. Danvers, being Rebecca's confidant, is like a real trouble area. Like, she knew all about the affairs. She knew Rebecca's ideology towards life, which was basically that she loved no one. She was just going to play everybody. And this is where like Mrs. Danvers gets like really, like, you kind of see how insane she is because she like fiercely admires the worst things about Rebecca. So you're literally just like, while you're reading, like, oh no, Maxim and the narrator are forgetting about what this person knows, and they're forgetting about this. Like, they're not covering their bases very well. But in the end, they're like kind of getting away with it. Like, things work out. It turns out that Rebecca wasn't pregnant at all. It seems that she had cancer, and she was just kind of goading Maxim. But because she had this terminal illness, that makes the powers that be believe the story that what actually happened was a suicide. Now, of course, Rebecca's cousin and Mrs. Danvers do not seem to believe that, so there are some loose threads, but it seems as if Maxim has, escaped any consequences. And so it's really interesting during all of these like final scenes is like the weather and the temperature and all of these things kind of create this sense of foreboding where every time you think it's over, more comes. So it's very good. It's very good at pulling you along into being like sighing in relief at one point and then it ratcheting back up again. And like the final pages of this book are really wild. I did not see it coming. Because like at the beginning of the book, we see the narrator and Maxim are not at Manderley anymore. They're staying in hotels, and we don't really know why. I kind of was theorizing that maybe they were going on the run in some way, so that like maybe they did think Maxim was a murderer and stuff. So then when Maxim's cleared and there's so few pages left in the book, I'm like, okay, then how are we going to get to that place where they're not at Manderley anymore? Like, I don't understand where this is going. And then Maxim, upon hearing that Mrs. Danvers has left the house, he has this like sick feeling, and there's this kind of like building tension in the last few pages that something bad is happening, but we don't know what it is. And then like in the final words of the book, we see that Manderley is on fire. And I believe we're presuming that this is because of Mrs. Danvers. And then the book just ends. Like, that's it. Like, we don't know if there were people inside of the house. You know, Manderley has a lot of servants. We don't know where Jasper the dog was. But we know that through her devotee, Rebecca has sort of created her last punishment, her final revenge, this act of chaos. And it's really like right when the narrator is finally feeling like Manderley is her home and that she loves it and that her and Maxim can actually have a life there, that it all comes crashing down. And Maxim also very much loves Manderley and the responsibility of having that kind of an estate. Yeah, so this is like a fairly devastating and shocking ending, and then it's just very abrupt. So for a narrator who's filled so much of the space in this book with descriptions and imaginings and so much of this musing, it's like at that point there's nothing left to say. So yeah, when I finished this book, I definitely had to like take a minute. So yeah, this was an excellent October read. It definitely fit the kind of vibes I was going for. I think Daphne Du Maurier, I would really like to read more of her work. She's kind of an important aesthetic maker in pop culture and horror and suspense. You know, Alfred Hitchcock adapted this and her story The Birds famously into film. It really seems like she was a voice that kind of defined a genre, and we probably owe a lot to her. So yeah, I'd like to read more of her work. I'd like to read more about her. I think she made in this kind of genre some very believable characters. The narrator especially feels very real, almost too real at times. And I don't know, I imagine it was kind of scandalous for a woman to be writing these sorts of things at the time. And if you're also looking for something that feels appropriate for the season, I would definitely recommend this as a great October read. Okay, well, that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.